The full moon in the great door was an omen, which she must sing to. Jean Toomer, Blood-Burning Moon. What is an omen but the past trying to warn us about our present and our future? In this video, I will be discussing how Black authors in the past up until the present have used the genre of horror to discuss the politics of their day and also to entertain their readers or watchers. I've broken this video up into several parts, each of which discussing a particular era and a work that connects with it, starting with the 1920s using Jean Toomer's Blood-Burning Moon, then the 1960s with Amiri Baraka's play Dutchman, and then finally modern times with the movie Get Out by Jordan Peele. Each time period has a specific issue that can be discussed using the works that were produced during that time. And there are specific philosophies that were also developed that informed the works being produced by Black authors. But I also believe that there is a through line that connects all of these works. Often when we discuss Black horror, we forget the timeline that each of these pieces were produced on, acknowledging that there are very similar aspects to them. But it is important to understand that these pieces were created during wildly different times. So in this video, I'll be discussing works from 100 years ago up until the present day. If we wish to understand how the genre is a reaction to the Black experience in America, we need to know that that experience has changed or if it stayed the same in the last century between the works that I'll be discussing today. To start from the beginning, we must have context, and to get that, we'll be starting in the 1920s. So let's go find out. And it's 1923. Warren G. Harding is president, Prohibition is in effect, and the Roaring Twenties are in full swing. This is also the year that Jean Toomer, a Harlem Renaissance author, pens his Blood-Burning Moon in his collection of short stories, Cain. In the context of the time, there is much that Jean Toomer would have been drawing from. In addition to the Jazz Age, there was also the ongoing horrors of lynch law in the South, segregation and voter suppression for people of color. All of these were pervasive throughout the time. 1923 was also the year of the Rosewood Massacre, which was a racially motivated event in Florida that may have influenced Toomer's writing. We won't know for sure, but I think it's safe to say that events such as this would have been on the mind of Toomer as he was writing his horror story. The prominent movements of the time within political and philosophical Black life were beginning with a flourishing of ideas during the Harlem Renaissance. Ida B. Wells had been working for years to promote the discussion of lynching because it had so previously been kept under wraps. And this expose of Southern lynch law probably also inspired Toomer. I have reasons to believe this because Jean Toomer, in writing Blood-Burning Moon, was one, creating a work of horror fiction, but also shining a light on the actual horror that was the reality for many Black people living in the United States. To help understand this, we have to know the philosophy that was around the time of the intellectuals that Jean Toomer would have been associating with. In the 1890s, decades before Blood-Burning Moon was published, W.E.B. Du Bois introduced the theory of double consciousness. Its idea that white supremacy causes a split sense of reality and self within Black people. This can be seen, or this idea at least, can be seen in Toomer's writing with the character of Tom, his feeling of emasculation by white supremacy, and being split by Louisa's split desire between him and Bob. The actual white supremacist character, Bob, as we see, can be seen as a stand-in for this perceived white supremacy that was pervasive at the time. This ideology was an early one in Black thought, but it was pervasive throughout the next centuries. So ideas such as gene tumors that were present in his Blood Burning Moon continued while being reactionary to his current situation and the current time that he was living in during the 1920s. They also bleed into future times. And it's 40 years later in the 1960s. At this time, we see a growth of new intellectualism and art styles and movements that were in tandem with the political and revolutionary actions during the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Liberation Movement. And different aspects of political and philosophical life working their way through Black art, Black authors, and different forms of expression during the time. Amiri Baraka wrote Dutchman in 1964 as a reflection of his beliefs and of also his life. But from it, even though it is allegorical to his biography, we can also see an extension and get a better glimpse at ongoing Black thought of the time. The 60s was a volatile time for Black identity and for thought, and the play, although allegorical, as I mentioned before, can be seen as an extension of that through line that connects it all the way back to the 20s and all the way back to the future. In terms of the content of the play, it draws a lot from the playwright's divorce from his wife and his move away from white intellectualism to a place that is further rooted within his own experience, as rather than what he saw as trying to fit in with white society at the time, which was in tandem with white supremacy. Later on in the 60s, Baraka would become an influential part of the Black arts movement, which sought to continue centering Black perspectives in media that they created. It was a collection of artists and playwrights and journalists who sought to take their own experiences and use that as their fuel and their creative fire, rather than trying to appeal to any white audience. But in terms of a through line, what are the connections between Blood Burning Moon and this play, Dutchman? Some of the same ideas expressed in the 1920s are further built upon in the 1960s by Baraka, 40 years later. There is this exploration of violence that is perpetrated against Black Americans. In Blood Burning Moon, this was shown in Tom's murder, and Clay's murder in Dutchman is also an example of this. The violence that was actually happening in reality in the 1920s with that pervasiveness of lynch law can be seen in extension in the 1960s with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and the reaction against civil rights protesters violently by white supremacist Americans. There is also an exploration of emasculation in Baraka's work. Tom's feeling of emasculation by white supremacy and Clay's feeling of emasculation by the other characters in Dutchman go hand in hand with this idea that white supremacy in both times was still pervasive in the American conscience and is still pervasive, as we'll see as it extends to modern times. So what changed? By the 60s, we see a greater emphasis by Black artists on pushing away from white notions and westernized ideas and trying to fit in or fit with and sit with people who had no experience living as a Black American. So while Clay is finally in the play shedding his westernized and white shell, as described by the other characters, and really stands to his own, he is finally murdered at the end of the play, in allegory to Baraka stepping away from his groups that dabbled in white intellectualism and finally expressing what he thought was a truer form of thought and experience that was grounded in his own life and his own lived experience as a Black man in America. So this building upon of the ideas that were first present in Toomer's work and then Baraka's can be seen in the following years as new theories emerge from this activism and this thought and this rhetoric that was going through in the 1960s. New theories and ideas are developed in Black media and in people who write about Black media, leading us to the present day. So for this final piece that I will be using to describe this journey that we've been on, I'll be talking about Jordan Peele's Get Out, which came out in 2017. And this will be our wrap-up of nearly 100-year-long journey of Black horror. When Get Out came out, I was 14 and just finishing my final year of 8th grade, my last year of middle school going into high school. So it's safe to say that I did not recognize the impact that this movie was going to have on American culture because that wasn't in my mind at the time. But now I understand how much we can look back and understand that this movie is very important, to say the least. Preceding the film, new theories came out that helped describe Black media. We saw Bell Hooks introduce the term oppositional gaze in the early 90s, which is decades before the movie came out, but still has an important impact on how people can analyze Get Out. With oppositional gaze, talking about creating Black media for Black audiences as a means of resistance. And we can see this in the debates to Get Out of to whether it was created for a Black audience or for a white audience. Who was the, if we saw it as a parable that had a moral, who was trying to be taught something? Was it a warning tale or was it something for white audiences to understand? And that's still an ongoing discussion and debate, one that we've had in class. But what is the through line that we see? The previous two works I talked about, Dutchman and Blood Burning Moon, were connected by the violence that they saw. Whereas we see the main character in Get Out wins in the end. Chris does not die in the end, which is a weird way of thinking of a victory of somebody just not dying. But Clay and Tom don't, and Chris does. So what is the through line between those? Well, we still see this political-minded writing that is still pervasive. In the 1920s, it was about what was going on then with lynch law. In the 60s, it was going about then with Black thought, Black ideology, and still with violence against Black Americans. And in the making of Get Out, we also see still violence against Black Americans with police brutality, and with the fear that came about with the presidential election that just preceded this movie. It was really a important and impactful film for Black Americans to really rally around. So it's important to understand each of these pieces as all connected in the fact that they all use Black horror to describe the situation that Black Americans find themselves in, because horror is something that is a genre, but for many Americans, for Black Americans, horror is a reality. So it is an interesting concept to take a life that is filled with fear and white supremacy pushing this split in people of color's minds and how they think about themselves, as W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, and taking that actual reality of living in a horror and trying to make a piece of fiction that resonates with that. And each of these authors try to do so in a different way that is reflective of the time that they're living in, but they have that through line going through of being very present of the time. Blood Burning Moon, again, 1920s in lynch law. Dutchman in the 1960s, about embracing that self-identity that we see later on with the Black arts movement, and pushing away Western and white notions of how to think, how to be, how to create art, who your audience is. And Get Out has been frequently cited as also highlighting the racial tensions that are still prevalent in America. Those tensions and that white supremacy that has been a through line, again, I keep using that word, but it's a good one that ties everything together. Those racial tensions were present in the 20s, in the 60s, and in modern times. So all of these works are made in different times, but at the end of the day, they are also brought together by the same situations. It's important to understand the context that these works are created in. Why? Because they were created hundreds of years apart. It isn't fair to completely compare Get Out to Blood Burning Moon, because when Blood Burning Moon came out, cars were a new thing, alcohol was illegal, it was before the Second World War. And when Get Out came out, it was in IMAX and surround sound, and it was a technological marvel filmed on digital cameras. Those are very separate situations that the work is created in, but they also reflect that same idea of highlighting the racial tensions in America, speaking to an audience who will understand that, writing works for other Black Americans that can resonate with the material. So, in conclusion, I know that's cliche to say, but at the end of the day, it's important to know that all these works were created in distinct moments in time and understand the context and the political situation, the author's thinking, why they say what they say, what they are seeing in the news that is influencing what they're writing. And it's also important to know that those events are all connected. The racial tensions of the 20s lead to the racial tensions of the 60s, lead on to the racial tensions that we still are dealing with today. And because those events are all connected, then the works that were written in those times are also all connected. So that is, when studying Black horror, an important thing to note. Thank you for coming with me on this journey through time. It has been illuminating to myself, and I hope it will be illuminating to whoever watches this. It is always nice to look back at the past and understand how that has led us into the present. I'm going to run through really quickly the citations for the websites that I took these pictures from, just to check all the boxes. So